Basic elements: sovereignty and predestination. A basic foundation of Calvin's religious system was an extremist view of God's sovereignty that denied the human will and considered the Church to be God's kingdom on earth, both views inspired by Augustine's writings. Verduin writes of Augustine, "Here we have an early representation of the notion that the Church of Christ was intended by its founder to enter into a situation radically different from the one depicted in the New Testament. This idea, set forth by Augustine, led to all sorts of theological absurdities. Augustine taught that foreknowledge was the same as predestination. Consequently, sometimes the same predestination is signified also under the name of foreknowledge. Thus, God's foreknowledge causes future events. Interestingly, R.C. Sproul writes that virtually nothing in John Calvin's view of predestination was not first in Martin Luther, and before Luther in Augustine. Calvin saw God as the author of every event, including all sin. If God merely foresaw human events, and did not also arrange and dispose of them at his pleasure, there might be room for agitating the question how far his foreknowledge amounts to necessity. But since he has decreed that they are so to happen, it is clear that all events take place by his sovereign appointment. R.C. Sproul states plainly, God wills all things that come to pass. God created sin. Out of this extreme view of God's sovereignty came Calvin's understanding of predestination. According to him, following the teaching of Augustine, in eternity past, God decided to save only a fraction of the human race, and consigned the rest to eternal torment simply because it pleased him to do so. Those, therefore, whom God passes by, he reprobates, and that for no other cause but because he is pleased to exclude them from the inheritance which he predestines to his children. But if all whom the Lord predestines to death are naturally liable to sentence of death, of what injustice, pray, do they complain? Because by his eternal providence they were before their birth doomed to perpetual destruction. What will they be able to mutter against this defense? Of this no other cause can be adduced than reprobation, which is hidden in the secret counsel of God. Now, since the arrangement of all things is in the hand of God, he arranges that individuals are born who are doomed from the womb to certain death, and are to glorify him by their destruction. God, according to the good pleasure of his will, without any regard to merit, elects those whom he chooses for sons, while he rejects and reprobates others. It is right for him to show by punishing that he is a just judge. Here the words of Augustine most admirably apply. When other vessels are made unto dishonor, it must be imputed not to injustice, but to judgment. In his Institutes, Calvin emphasizes sovereignty, but scarcely mentions God's love for sinners. Luther, too, was convinced that God, by his own sovereign choice and independent of anything in man, had from eternity past determined whom he would save and whom he would damn. Calvin, like Augustine and most Calvinists today, said God could foresee the future only because he had willed it. Here we have the horrible doctrine of reprobation from Calvin's own pen, echoing once again his mentor, Augustine. We say, then, that Scripture clearly proves this much, that God, by his eternal and immutable counsel, determined once for all those whom it was his pleasure one day to admit to salvation, and those whom, on the other hand, it was his pleasure to doom to destruction. We maintain that this counsel, as regards the elect, is founded on his free mercy, without any respect to human worth, while those whom he dooms to destruction are excluded from access to life by a just and blameless, incomprehensible judgment. By excluding the reprobate, he by these mocks, in a manner, discloses the judgment which awaits them.